English because else it gets too complicated to speak in Norwegian and see my own text in English. So what I wanted to do is give you some reasons why I think that indigenous peoples or Sami should receive more attention in school curriculums. Then we can go to the next slide. Well, just in case somebody in this room doesn't know what indigenous peoples are or how they are defined officially, they are people who are descended from the populations that inhabited the country or geographical region at the time of conquest, colonization, or establishment of present state boundaries. They usually retain some or all of the social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, irrespective of their legal status. So there are two elements here: descent from altså folk som har bodd i landet som man ser på, før nåværende landegrense ble trukket, og før man eventuelt ble kolonisert. Det er faktisk det som har skjedd med urfolk flest, eller alle. Og så har man bibeholdt noen av sine egne sosiale, økonomiske, kulturelle eller politiske institusjoner, ikke minst en sans av identitet. Men så setter jeg her i klammer what is a people? That's a really difficult question. And if you guys want, you can come up with some thoughts how we should define people, because we know today that what makes people distinct is not their set of genes. And we also know that people, ethnic groups and people maintain their borders despite the fact that the cultural stuff inside those borders is changing. So objectively, we are both genetically and culturally increasingly hybrids. And yet people all over the world, including indigenous peoples and the people categorizing indigenous peoples, maintain that the ethnic boundaries that we have used for a long time now should stay in place. And then the next slide. Well, the typical situation was colonization for indigenous peoples, and that is one of the reasons for the current state of affairs. Indigenous peoples have been colonized, they've lost their political sovereignty. In many cases, they have been exposed to genocide, both in the form of war or sometimes even strategically introduced epidemic diseases. And in some cases, forced sterilization. Indigenous peoples have also suffered everywhere where they have been colonized. The first onslaught of colonization, apart from genocide and conquest, was missionization. They were first forced to give up their native religion. They have lost traditional lands. They have been forced to move to other places. They have been deported. They ended up in reservations or somewhere else where they originally did have no intention to be. They have been exposed to assimilative policies. They have been forced to give up important parts of their cultures, including their cultural identity. In many cases, they have been placed in boarding schools forcefully. In some cases, native children have been forcefully adopted away from their natural parents. Native peoples have suffered economic marginalization. They have been discriminated in the labor market in recent history. They have certainly been stigmatized, which has resulted in a lot of psychological, psychosocial problems, including higher rates of alcohol and drug abuse compared with the majorities that surround them. They have suffered more or less from identity struggles, finding a sense of ethnic belonging, including a loss of language. And in recent decades, we have observed in Norway, as well as in other countries, tendencies towards revitalization. That is, the situation of indigenous peoples on the overall has in many respects become better. And the 3 points I want to draw your attention to is that indigenous peoples, for the first, indigenous people illustrate the cost of the human cost of assimilation, stigmatization, and marginalization in very impressive ways. We can see people who are struggling to have an identity, to have a sense of belonging that is not constantly challenged by the majority or by minorities inside their minority. Shame has been an issue associated with stigma. There is a sense of inadequacy and inferiority that has been widespread. Trauma has been observed, often across generations, in many of the countries where indigenous peoples have been exposed to assimilationist policies. We can also observe higher rates of behavioral problems, including drug and alcohol abuse, as I said already. Also, depression and suicide is much more widespread. The suicide rates of indigenous peoples in as different places as Greenland, Alaska, Siberia, Australia and New Zealand, and in fact also Scandinavia or Sápmi. The suicide rates are alarming, and in general, the statistics of indigenous peoples on a number of these variables indicating stress and trauma and a less than optimal life situation, these statistics are quite alarming. Then the other topic where I find indigenous peoples interesting also to be incorporated in various ways in the current school curriculas is that indigenous peoples are sort of guardians, or in some case one might say like the canary birds in the mines before. They're guardians of sustainable development in many important ways. And the reason is that traditionally indigenous people have used natural resources in ways that didn't create massive environmental problems. They have certainly been able to create local environmental problems at times. And as I usually point out in my teaching, if indigenous peoples always had behaved ecologically wise, the human race or humans wouldn't have spread all across the world. It was usually a result of overexploitation of local resources that led to people moving somewhere else. But still, the massive environmental problems that, for example, industrialized societies can cause are not something that is observed in traditional indigenous subsistence strategies. Both soil, forests, animals, and plants are important in their lives. Of course, this is a generalization here. There are many indigenous people who consider themselves indigenous, but who are not living in traditional ways. But those who do For those who do, both the soil, forests, animals, plants are very important, and which is why there is usually a keen interest in protecting them. Historically, over the past decades, indigenous peoples have resisted economic development which destroys their natural habitats and overexploits natural resources. For example, mining projects, hydroelectric projects, deforestation, and so on have been heavily exposed by the local indigenous peoples. They have often been involved in protests against deforestation, hydroelectric projects, mining, roads, water pollution, and potentially dangerous oil pipelines like in Standing Rock in the United States over the past years. And then there is, this is just, the next one. We can jump over this. We don't need this now. And then there's the issue of language. I have realized both when I did my own research in Alaska among Yupik Eskimos and when I lived in Kautokeino and worked at samiske videregående skole og rendriftsskole, that language is of great concern to a lot of indigenous people. And some people might wonder, well, why bother? The fact is many indigenous languages are disappearing. And here it is important to remember, and it is really important to let that sink in, that languages are not simply different ways of saying and thinking exactly the same kinds of things, just with different words and sounds or signs. If that would be the case, it would really not matter much if certain languages disappear. But this is not how language works. Languages are, in fact, more or less different conceptualizations of the stuff of experience. There is, in other words, a worldview, certain perspectives in language. And it is the expressions and statements that are difficult to translate that are most interesting. Not everything can be said or even recognized equally well in every language. And in that respect, metaphors and idiomatic expressions would illustrate that. Language is also very closely tied to identity, probably exactly for that reason, because people experience a certain congruity in their individual recognition when they speak to people who have the same mother tongue. What I have given you on the next slides are just some indications of documentaries that I think are worth watching with respect to some examples of current conflicts between indigenous peoples and environmentally damaging projects, and interesting movies that take up aspects of indigenous peoples with respect to the consequences of assimilationist policies on the one hand, and for example, boarding schools, and how it is to be indigenous and yet live in 2020.